Hi and welcome to another sketchbook tour. So I began watercolor painting in October of 2022 and I have already shared my first two sketchbooks where I started as an absolute beginner in two previous videos that I will link here. And today I am sharing my third sketchbook with you, which I began in May of 2023. So I had been painting for 7 months when I started the sketchbook. So it is still a beginner sketchbook. And as you can see, like I do with all my sketchbooks, I have numbered it and dated it. And I also like to page through my sketchbooks at the end when I'm finished with them and reflect upon what I've done and look at the themes and lessons that stood out to me. And based off that, I make a little logo for each sketchbook. So it's hard to recognize. It didn't turn out very well, but the sketchbook's logo is a bunch of flowers and a moon. Here as well, we've got the moon theme, and I went with mountains. And at the back of each sketchbook at the end, I also write a few words. And this one was of life by color: reds, pinks, oranges, and purples, blues and greens and browns, of fruits and flowers and acorns, mushrooms, nuts, and terracotta pots. And Opspaar, Balaton, home again. I also like to write where I was traveling with the book. So this one traveled with me to Lake Balaton in Hungary during summer. Of Life by Color was an extremely appropriate title for this sketchbook because this is a sketchbook where I plunged into full Daniel Smith watercolor testing madness. For those of you who have seen my previous sketchbook tour of the second one, I already began dabbling in Daniel Smith watercolors at the end of that sketchbook. I had ordered some dot cards to swatch out some Daniel Smith paint and realized that I truly love these paints and I wanted to test them thoroughly before choosing the final colors for my palette. So this is when I went ahead and ordered the 238 color dot card that Daniel Smith offers, and it contains their standard paints, which is already a large selection, but it also contains their Primatech colors and their Luminescent watercolors. And I initially swatched them out one by one, very dutifully, and I went from the yellows, oranges, reds, and I was swatching them out to look at how concentrated or light they can get, how they diffuse, how they lift, and how opaque they are, and how they wash out. And I worked my way through all 238 colors in my swatch book. And this already gave me an idea of how the paints worked, but I was still undecided on many colors on which I would add to my palette eventually. And so, after swatching each color individually and remaining undecided, I did what any sane person would do. I ordered the same dot cards again and decided to sketch with each color individually. And that is what happened in the sketchbook. I started using every single Daniel Smith color one by one in sketches to see how they mix and how they work. So let's dive into this Daniel Smith madness. So for the first spread of my sketchbook, I always like to open my sketchbook with where I am in the world and the date. And here I was working with the yellows. I was working from coolest to warmest. So on these dandelions, the outer edges are the very cool yellows, which are the nickel titanate yellow, the bismuth van Dyke yellow, and the Hansa yellow light, as well as the cadmium yellow light hue. And I was working from the outside towards the center of the flowers. And all of these very light colors that I mentioned are very bright. They almost have a fluorescent quality to them, in particular the bismuth van Dyke yellow and the Hansa yellow light. But all of them are actually quite opaque. Particularly the bismuth van Dyke yellow is almost like a gouache. It's extremely opaque. However, the cadmium yellow light and the Hansa yellow light were also very opaque compared to what I expected initially. So that was quite a surprise. And my conclusion was that in the Daniel Smith range, the very cool yellows are unfortunately all on the more opaque side. And I have actually ended up using, for my cool yellow, a Winsor & Newton yellow instead. However, there are warm yellows from here that I fell in love with. So for the medium yellows, I was moving on to the Azo yellow, the cadmium yellow medium, the Aurelian, the lemon yellow, and the Hansa yellow medium. And these were layering on quite nicely. All of these mixed very well, except for the nickel titanate and the bismuth vandate, because those were really milky and chalky is the word I'm looking for. So the medium yellows went on quite nicely. I wouldn't have any particular complaints or praises to make about any of them. The cadmium yellows hues, none of them are a real cadmium yellow, they're all the hue, so it's cadmium yellow light hue and deep hue, which means that it's a mix reproducing the color without actually containing cadmium. I can't say that any of them impressed me to the point of me wanting them on my palette, and my main complaint with all of them actually was the opaqueness. The lemon yellow, which is a little bit more transparent and I had high hopes for, I was actually quite disappointed with because it is quite sticky. There's this greasy, sticky quality to the paint where you can really see the brush marks. And when I was painting with it, so the flowers are quite small and you can't really see it that well, but even when you paint with it, this is quite visible. I had the same complaint for the Mayan yellow and the Indian yellow, where both of these also have quite a greasy, almost soapy texture, probably linked to the binder, and they leave very visible brush marks. The Indian yellow also I was quite disappointed with because it does give a bit of a dirty appearance when it's mixed with the other colors, as you can see at the base, particularly of this flower. But moving on to the warmer yellows, I did have a particular fancy for the new gamboge. So I will just move over to show you the sample. And the new gamboge is beautifully transparent compared to the other colors. It is one of the more transparent ones. And it does have a lovely variation from this bright flame orange to a nice warm yellow. And that one actually worked very well. I have lined the edges of many of these petals with the new gamboge, and it worked very well for glazing, and it worked very well on its own as well. So that was one that went onto my palette. And another one that I had a special mention for was the Aussie Red Gold, which although it does granulate slightly, even though Daniel Smith does not class it as a granulating color, when painting with it, there is clearly some texture and granulation going on. But it's got a lovely variation and it's very bright. So this one was a very nice, rusty, bright orange to add. And we will mix. I then moved on to the reds, and here I was mixing. The dot cards also sometimes have very small amounts of paint squeezed onto them, and for the reds this was actually the case. Some of the reds had such small quantities that I could only paint a single layer on a single strawberry with them, and I was wanting to go lighter to darker and see how they blend. So here I was using Pyrrole Red, Cadmium Red Medium, Cadmium Yellow Deep just for the seeds and the lower edges, the Perylene Red, the Permanent Red, the Perylene Scarlet, Pyrrole Crimson. And then for the leaves, even though this wasn't a page for testing greens, there are still green leaves, and this was the Serpentine Green and the Undersea Green, which I will talk about later. These are some of my two very favorite greens from Daniel Smith, and I really enjoy painting with them. So I did have some disappointment with the Cadmium Red hue, as well as the Permanent Red, which once painted on and blending with the other colors, turned out muted and not as vibrant. In particular on the strawberry, you can see I'm using the Permanent Red and the Perylene Red, as well as the Cadmium Red Medium here. And it really didn't turn out as bright as some of the other reds did. In terms of the ones that I was very pleased with, funnily enough, the Mayan Orange, even though the Mayan range of colors was very slick and a bit greasy, the orange stood out because unlike the Mayan Yellow or the Mayan Blue, it's actually a lot smoother and it's quite intense. So this was a nice surprise. The Organic Vermilion was also very bright and beautiful, but it is not light fast as much as some of the other colors, which is why I did not end up adding it to my palette, but they were really beautiful. The Pyrrole Scarlet also was very intense and remained intense when painting with it. And the Perylene Scarlet also was a lovely dark red. So those were the ones that stood out to me. And we will talk about this on the cherry page when I started moving into the cooler reds and pinks. But the Quinacridone Coral, as you can see, is actually also very slick and greasy and leaves very visible paint marks and is not an easy paint to spread. As you can see, it barely diffuses when dropped into water. So in the medium reds, these were the ones that I was less impressed by. The cadmium red medium hue, which looks washed out and almost a bit dirty. The pyrrole red also, which looked quite cool and lifeless. It wasn't particularly as vibrant or as striking as the pyrrole scarlet. And same for the perylene red, which felt a bit cool and lifeless once again, as well as the permanent red. So surprisingly, these four colors, especially when they're diluted, and the permanent red deep, were not very striking, and I would definitely recommend to go with one of these instead if you're looking for a scarlet or warmer red. So in the cool reds and by now pinks, the ones that I would not recommend are the Mayan red. Once again, like the rest of the Mayan range, with the exception of the Mayan orange, the Mayan red was very slimy and slick and impossible to spread nicely on the paper. But some of the other cool reds really stood out. So the quinacridons, it's really the red that is the easiest to spread and stood out to me. The quinacridone coral, as you saw on the previous page, is also very hard to spread, as well as the quinacridone pink and rose. So these are the ones up here, and you can see the visible brush marks. But let's look at how they blended with the strawberries. So this was a mix of pyrrole crimson, quinacridone rose, and even in this little sample, you can see the brush marks. The carmine, which I found, again, a little bit lifeless. It wasn't as deep and intense as I would have imagined from the color sheet that they provide you. The Bordeaux, which was a little bit cooler than I had hoped for, the quinacridone violet, the permanent violet, the alizarin crimson. This was a beautiful color. And they have the original alizarin crimson, which is a beautiful color to work with here on the swatch. And then they have, but it's not light fast. And then they have the permanent alizarin crimson, which is light fast. But the color is really not comparable. If you look at the two, the permanent alizarin crimson is browner and has more of a brick hue than the alizarin crimson, which is very vibrant, and especially because this book has not been exposed to much light, it has stayed very bright and vibrant here, whereas the permanent alizarin crimson, funny enough, seems to have faded and lost intensity. So that is a bit ironic that the permanent light fast version has actually lost color in a closed book, while the non-light fast version has remained bright and vibrant. The carmine as well looked very interesting on the printed sheet and was not as exciting on the swatches. And moving on, I had some different browns and purples here. So these were the perylene violet and the lunar red rock, as well as the raw umber violet for the stems, and the leaves were just serpentine genuine and deep sap green. The greens, I have a whole section later. But basically what stood out here was the quinacridone rose for its color. Even though it was quite slimy, you can actually see some of the brush marks here as well on some of the cherries. And the alizarin crimson, which was really the bright, beautiful color here. And the perylene violet also stood out to me because it was very intense and it was a very beautiful, strong color. And by now I realized that I needed to stop doing the testing in such a disorganized manner. So there's improvement. I have gone from 0 side swatches to try to record some of the colors. And here I actually started to catalog the colors. So here we were in the oranges. And so the oranges I was looking at were the permanent orange, the Mayan orange, and the Perrinoin orange. And for contrast, I had used the rose of ultramarine and quinacridone violet. The Perrinoin orange is really beautiful. I actually ended up buying this for my palette because it is a very nice, I almost want to say bubblegum orange. It's got that real sweetness to it. Underneath it, there's the permanent orange, which is much more yellow, and you can see that in the highlights. And the Mayan orange was the very nice surprise because unlike the rest of the Mayan colors, it spread really nicely. It was quite intense. So that was a very interesting, deep scarlet orange. I didn't need one for my palette, but it was a pleasant surprise. But I did go with the Perignon orange just because it looks like, I keep wanting to call it a kawaii orange. It looks very bright and sunny and intense and juicy. And here, these are also a mix of permanent orange and Perignon orange, but much more dilute. And this is where I've used the rose of ultramarine as a contrast. And there's also some at the back here. Here on these ones, I've gone with the pyrrole orange and then the transparent orange for the lily. And I was not blown away. I found the pyrrole orange quite weak and very cool. I have used ultramarine blue for the shadows, but even the places where the orange is isolated without any blue, I find it quite cold and again, a little bit lackluster. And for the lily, I had some nice surprises, particularly with the quinacridone red, which turned out to be very intense, very bright, and very easy to spread. And I have currently got the quinacridone rose in my palette, but I do know that I'll be going for quinacridone red when I refresh. I will no longer be staying with the rose. And then just some permanent brown and burnt umber for the stamens. Moving on to the reds. Here I was trying to reproduce reds without direct red. So I was using a mixture of pinks and oranges and browns to give a red effect for these three sketches. And so on this little guy, we have a pyrrole orange, the quinacridone red, and just some Payne's gray and perylene maroon and neutral tint for the darker areas. And I was very happy with the combination of pyrrole orange and quinacridone red. I remain very impressed by the quinacridone red, which was the easiest of the quinacridones to use. And the perylene maroon also was a lovely dark brick red brown color, which I have actually ended up adding to my palette, and I use this surprisingly often, even more than I expected. Here as well, I was trying to recreate a red without a direct red. So once again, there's a perylene maroon, quinacridone lilac, permanent brown, and then for the leaves, this one is purely olive green, which is a beautiful color, and I really enjoyed it. And apparently in there's a bit of naphthamid maroon, which was a very pale color and probably not very visible here. There might just be a little bit visible in the lighter areas. For the mushrooms, we've gone with pyrrole orange again, quinacridone rose, quinacridone pink, perylene maroon. I was loving the maroon, clearly. Neutral tint, hematite burnt scarlet, and German green raw umber, as well as the English red ochre. These two, funny enough, I loved. So the English red ochre is a beautiful, soft, orangey pink earth tone, and it is a lovely soft tone. I do not do much landscape painting or paintings where I use earth tones that much. But if I was building an earth tone palette, this would definitely be a contender. And the German green raw umber, funnily enough, when I looked at the 238 colors, I thought this one would be one of the top 5 ugliest. Yet I found it extremely versatile and useful for painting little things like moss and grasses. So that actually turned out to be a very malleable and useful color, and I'm actually still considering adding that to my palette. And the bougainvilleas, let's talk about this. There was a color that I truly loved in here, which was the rose madder. They have the rose madder permanent, and this one looked so good in a single layer. It was transparent and light. I had added a bit of perylene green for the stems and a bit of quinacridone lilac for the darker parts. And then I wanted to try and darken it up and add a second layer. This is when things went sideways, as they often do. So there's some quinacridone magenta for the shadows and some quinacridone fuchsia on the bougainvilleas. And this one was harder. It is very intense and overpowering. And the rose madder is a beautiful delicate pink, which I hesitated between. I was looking for a delicate bubblegum pink that could go light and transparent. And this was a strong contender, and I'll show you the competition. So it was either going to be Rose Madder Permanent or the Rhodonite Genuine. So the Rhodonite Genuine is part of what Daniel Smith, here's the swatch, is part of what Daniel Smith calls the Primatech range. So it is pure mineral pigments and they have their own way of manufacturing them or sourcing them. I'm not sure, I'm not an expert, but I do know that their Primatech range is something that they offer as their own speciality. So they have a lovely cool blue in the Primatech range called Rhodonite Genuine, which is over here, and which I found was quite close to the Rose Madder Permanent, just in a slightly cooler version. And I ended up preferring the Rhodonite Genuine just because it was a bit more luminous and bright. So on this page, since I've been talking about it so much, we have the Rhodonite Genuine for the starfish and the shells over here, and I've layered a little bit of cobalt blue violet for the shadows over these. I was testing some more intense pinks because it was sweet pea season. This is already in July, and my neighbors thought I was a little bit creepy walking around the neighborhood taking photos of their sweet peas. But I really enjoy them, and I love the smells as well. So here I was testing the quinacridone fuchsia, the quinacridone lilac, and the opera rose, which is very bright fluorescent color. And I was trying to mix it in to see if I could make it feel a bit more natural, because I don't see myself using this on its own. And also it is not light fast. This is not something I would add to my palette, but I was interested to see how it might work with other colors, and it's also what I used for the lettering here. And then for the deeper tones, I used some rows of ultramarine, imperial purple, and then for the stems, it's a mix of permanent green light, cascade green, and phthalo yellow green. So all of these very almost fluorescent greens, which worked really well for the sweet peas. And I thought they were lovely if you're looking for bright tropical greens. And then some of the very dark shadows here are the quinacridone purple. So what stood out to me was the quinacridone fuchsia, actually, because I found it not too bright and overpowering, and I found that it actually mixed out very well and blended very well. So I decided to do a sketch uniquely with the quinacridone fuchsia, which is what we have here. And it's got a lovely texture. It almost has a bit of granulation, but it's still easy to work with and to create a smooth blend with. For the pot, we've got some burnt umber and the Sedona Genuine, which actually for terracotta pots is a lovely base color. It's also one of the Primatech colors. And in the purples, here I've just gone and made a little sketch of the cobalt violet deep. Here we have the cobalt violet and the ultramarine violet. And the last one is the cobalt blue violet. These colors are all quite similar, but I really found differences in the texture. So the cobalt violet deep is actually also quite slick and very hard to have a smooth wash with. It almost looks like I've drawn this with coloring pencil, and it's very hard to get a smooth wash with this one. It is also quite slick. Same for the cobalt violet, beautiful warm violet color, but very difficult to have a smooth wash with. It is slick and sticky, and your brush marks are very visible. And the ultramarine violet is quite similar. But the worst was really the cobalt violet deep and the cobalt violet were really hard to get a smooth wash with. The cobalt blue violet was beautiful, and it does move a lot with the water. So here again, you need to be a bit patient, but it is easier to work with than the previous three. And this color was just so beautiful. It really reminded me of jacarandas in bloom or beautiful crystals. And this is something I did add to my palette just because it was such a beautiful, intense color. And for the alliums, I was just testing some pinks and purples. Here we have some Potter's pink. And for the deeper shades, there's some quinacridone purple. And for the bigger ones, we have some cobalt blue violet, again, the same as we have down here. Some French ultramarine on the cooler tones, and some imperial purple for the darker tones. And the stems are just different mixes of shadow violet, zoisite, and undersea green. And the comments I would have about these ones is the Potter's pink, which surprisingly I wanted to love every Daniel Smith color. And here we have the swatch of the Potter's pink. However, I stayed with my Potter's pink from Schminke, from my original pan, because I found that it was actually closer to a pink color, and I found the Potter's pink from Daniel Smith to be cooler and a little bit more pulling towards the gray, so less saturated. It granulates well, it's a nice color, but I do prefer the warmer and more intense Potter's pink from Schminke. But the purples were lovely, and I did end up picking up a few of them for my palette. We will see also later which ones I picked up. But the cobalt blue violet was one that I fell in love with here, as well as the French ultramarine, which there will be a lot more of later. It was also delphinium season, so I was having experiments by now in the sketchbook of every flower I could find in the neighboring gardens. So here I was testing the quinacridone purple again with imperial purple for the dark tones, and for the very dark purple tones, this was the carbazole violet. And this is the one I ended up picking up because it is just so intense, and a little goes such a long way. And the blues were just the Verditer blue, and the greens are the green Appetite Genuine and the rare green Earth. So you can see a little bit how those blend out. The green Appetite Genuine here, I already started enjoying it immensely because there's a huge amount of color variation within it, and it granulates in a very interesting way, separating into two different color pigments. So that one already struck me, as well as the carbazole violet, which was so intense, and I needed to work with it more. On this page, I just went to the olive green. I wanted something lighter and more delicate, as well as the Verditer blue. And here I discovered two colors that I really fell in love with and have added both of them to my palette, which are the lavender and wisteria. Now, both of these colors are a mix of pigments, and they contain a little bit of white pigment. So they have a bit of milky quality to them, and they're almost like gouache, but a little bit more transparent. They're not as opaque as a gouache, but they really have the most beautiful pastel tones to them. So all of these pink flowers are wisteria, and then the lavender you can see on the warmer blues here, while the Verditer is the cooler blues over here. If you want to see the swatches of what those look like, this is the wisteria, and really such a beautiful color, but you can see quite clearly that it's not 100% transparent. And the purples we've spoken about, the quinacridone purple, which is very intense, but a bit warmer, and I wanted something cooler. And this is the one I ended up going with, which is the carbazole violet. It is extremely intense. It can become very saturated, and I really like the versatility of a paint or a pigment that can go from very dark to very light. And this was a cobalt blue violet that I absolutely loved for its color, even though it wasn't necessarily the easiest one to work with. I did do more work on the purples, but I first had a hiatus of trying to paint a night sky. This was actually inspired from a YouTube video I saw from Nyani, who does lovely YouTube tutorials. And I had a first attempt. I wasn't quite happy. I had a second attempt. So here I'm using a mixture of three colors. I'm using quinacridone violet, Moonglow for the granulation, and the blue I'm using, I think, is a phthalo blue. Yes, it's a phthalo blue with a Moonglow and a quinacridone pink. And for the clouds, there's a little bit of buff titanium. And just for the white parts afterwards, I did a little bit of Posca pen to create the stars. But this was hard. So definitely trying to make the blends of the night skies was hard. And the next day I came back and did a third attempt before I finally had a result that I was more or less happy with. And while we were in the purples, of course, I had to work with Moonglow. I consider this a bit of a purple. So it is a mix of three pigments, but the final result is a lovely purplish gray. And on this squid, I have an undercoat of quinacridone pink, very pale quinacridone pink, and then covered in Moonglow. And it actually creates a lovely base for the fluorescent colors. So Daniel Smith has the duochrome range, which when used alone looks colorless, and it looks very good on dark paper, however, or over darker paint. So this actually shows up on a dark surface. And I did these little dots in the duochrome lapis sunlight. And you can see that they have lovely blue, pale blue and gold reflections. So that was actually a nice way of using the duochromes, and I wanted to get into them more, and there will be more of them later on. But still in the purples, I was into aubergines. Now, this is where I tested the carbazole violet versus the cobalt blue violet, and here is a mixture of cobalt blue violet with quinacridone rose. And this is really where I understood that the Carbazole Violet would be the most versatile. It can really go to extremely dark shadows. It doesn't granulate. It's smooth to work with. You have to be very sparing with it, but it is a lovely intense color. And I was just experimenting with different ways of painting the leaves and stems. So here I was using a mix of olive green again, which I really love. I don't know why I haven't added this to my palette. This is definitely on my next purchase list. And the Tiger's Eye, some neutral tint for the shadows under the aubergines, as well as some moon glow. I was testing different shadow colors. But the fun part of this whole sketchbook was that I was running around at all times. I became obsessed with this, and I was running around with a list in my phone at all times, trying to think of different subjects for each color. So I had a list of rainbow colors on my notes on my phone, and every time an idea popped into my head, I'd go and write it down. And it was really funny because for 9 months that it took me to complete the sketchbook, I was obsessed with looking for ideas and small subjects and references for each color. This was during my time in Hungary in Lake Balaton, and I wanted to paint an abstract piece. And I say this because it's so funny. I really don't have any abstract painting experience, so I was just experimenting. But when the sun would set, the sky would have these beautiful pinks and lilacs, which would fade into the blue of the lake, which was perfectly flat and still and would be a beautiful mirror to the sky. So this was my abstract interpretation of Lake Balaton at sunset. What I did love was, again, the mix of moon glow here, and there's also some Sodalite Genuine, some phthalo blue turquoise, a bit of lavender. So I was mixing all of the different blues, and they mixed very well. Especially, as I said, the Sodalite Genuine is something I have picked up for my palette. The phthalo turquoise, the lavender, these I have picked up for my palette as well. They worked really well. I was also trying some architectural sketching at the local castle nearby. I went and did 2 different versions of it. I tried to do a tight version of it. So this is a castle called Festetic Kastély, which I visited on the 27th of August and finally got around to finishing almost a month later on the 14th of September. Because I was quite ambitious, I really tried to do the whole thing with a lot of detail in micron fine liner and then do the paint. And I wanted to compare that with doing a loose style without any underdrawing or pen and just doing the watercolor. Clearly, the no drawing version is messy. There are some perspective problems happening here. It's more like the leaning tower than a straight tower. But I did realize that I actually really enjoy the loose styles more, and this is something I gravitate to more. I find that there's something too tight and too constrained about this, and I wasn't that pleased with it despite the many, many hours of work I had put into it. In terms of the colors I was using in these sketches, this is a cobalt blue. This is still the Verditor blue. The cobalt blue I was super happy with. It's the swatch right over here. It's a lovely mid blue. It doesn't go extremely dark, but it is very easy to work with. It blends out very smoothly, and it is a very vibrant and beautiful blue. And the Verditor, which I had already used in the Delphiniums as well as here, I was not struck by. And if you are hesitating, so this is the Verditor blue, and it is granulating. It's a mid blue. It's slightly cooler, but in terms of the mid blues, if you're hesitating between 2, for me, the cobalt blue really won the competition. Even though they call it a granulating color, it doesn't granulate very much, and it is very smooth, and it just turns out very beautiful. Whereas the Verditor blue I found slightly less vibrant, and it is a bit cooler, and it granulates quite a bit more. And then the grays, this was a mix of Payne's gray, and there was some yellow ochre in a very dilute concentration here. This is where I was starting to use the duochromes and the fluorescent colors, and it's not in chronological order. So this is when I came back towards the end of the sketchbook. I was filling up empty pages that I had left behind. So this is from the 30th of December, so it's the end of year sketch. And I was sketching my view over the mountains in Switzerland. But the interesting thing here was the duochrome colors. So here I was using the duochromes, In particular, the ones that I really enjoyed were the mauve, which is these beautiful pink ones here. And there's the Arctic fire that you can see over the tops of the mountains, aptly named Arctic fire for mountaintops. The base layer was just indigo blue, and the sky is also a gradient of indigo blue and phthalo turquoise. And then the mountains had the shades of duochrome mauve and the Arctic blue, namely. And then there's also a bit of the duochromes in the blues over the sky. And they show up better over a darker paint, which is why it was interesting doing a darker non-luminescent layer and then adding the bright paints. I tried another abstract piece, and I keep laughing at myself when I see these because it feels so pretentious. But the mountain behind my place is one of the most famous mountains of Switzerland, called Rigi, and it's a beautiful place. And we had a lovely sunset walk with the dogs, and there was a beautiful orange glow of the sun setting over the grey mountains, some of which were already tipped with snow. And we had the blues of the lake and the forest around us, and I was doing an abstract representation of this. I can't help but laugh. I really cannot take myself seriously when I say these things. But once again, the colors I kept gravitating to, which I discovered would have to be on my palette, were the Moon Glow, as well as the Sodalite Genuine. I kept coming to those for the moody blues. The Potter's Pink, which I was trying to use here, I understood was not as warm and bright as I wanted it to be. And in terms of the greens, I was also still undecided at this point, and I knew that I would need to be exploring those quite a bit more. But first it was time for the blues. And I had done, in my previous sketchbook, I had done a course on Domestica from Inga Buividavice, and she has a beautiful course, and she has also published 2 beautiful watercolor books by now. And on her palette, one of the blues she keeps referring to all the time is Mayan Blue from Daniel Smith. And she's actually one of the reasons that I first purchased Daniel Smith colors to test. So I had really high hopes for this Mayan Blue because the color looked beautiful in her paintings. But it is extremely slick and very difficult to paint with. In fact, not only do the paint marks remain visible, but even the little air bubbles are visible as the paint dries. I found this very difficult to work with, even though I absolutely loved the color. Here I have just used the Mayan Blue with the Shadow Violet. The Shadow Violet I loved, on the other hand. It is a mix of several different pigments. It granulates beautifully. It spreads very nicely on the paper, very smooth and easy to work with. So that one got bonus points, but the Mayan Blue I wanted to love so much, and I was just unable to do anything aesthetic with it. And then the Sodalite Genuine, which you've heard me referring to several times throughout the video. So this is one of the Primatech colors. And here it is on the swatch. And this is actually what I use as a replacement for Payne's Gray. So I don't have Payne's Gray on my palette because I find it very desaturated. Of course, it's meant to be gray, but I would like a gray with a stronger blue undertone, which is exactly what Sodalite Genuine is, and it also has a beautiful strong granulation, and it can go very intense. So the texture and color on this one was very pleasing to me when it's used concentrated or when it's used as several light layers. So this one definitely already had a place on my palette. On this page, I was looking at the Indan Throne Blue specifically, which is a lovely, warm, deep blue and reminds me very much of the Delft pottery or some of the Chinese pottery. So it's a very nice, intense blue, and I used exclusively the Indan Throne Blue on the left urn, and on the right one I tried to reproduce the same effect using phthalo blue and indigo and Prussian blue. I wanted to see if I could mix a blue or get a blue effect that was similar to Indan Throne, so that I wouldn't need to buy the tube. And the short answer was no, I could not reproduce the same intensity and warmth with the other blues. So the difference is quite subtle, and maybe on the camera it's even more subtle, but there is more warmth and intensity, and it almost has a sheen. So I have used Indan Throne Blue in extremely thick layers at times to create dark midnight blue backgrounds. and it almost has a little bit of shine or sheen. It's not completely as matte as the other colors, and that actually was interesting. It also explains why it's very smooth and very dark. That really appealed to me. For the shadows, I'm also using some Lunar Violet, and on the leaves here I'm using some English Red Earth, which is a lovely soft granulating earth tone, which I had absolutely no use for. On the blue pages again, here I was testing a lot of the indigo I really wanted to get comfortable with, and there's also the phthalo blue and the Prussian blue. So all of these little maidenhair ferns on the left are Prussian blue, and then these are different dilutions of indigo and Prussian blue with some touches of phthalo blue for the brighter parts. And the phthalo blue I have on my palette. It seems to be a staple. When I was starting out, a lot of tutorials recommended it, so I bought it. And I might have used it once in the last year. It's definitely not a color I reach for. It's definitely not a color I will refresh. Same for the Prussian blue. I did end up ordering it because it seemed to be such a common go-to, and it is not something I reach for. The indigo, however, I've already had to refill my tubes, and this is something I am grabbing all the time. The outlines around these, though, which I found very nice, were the Geothite Brown Ochre and the Mount Amiata Sienna, and these made a lovely gold tone. Particularly the Mount Amiata makes a very nice light gold alternative to yellow ochre. It's much lighter, much more muted, it's not so bright. And the yellow ochre, again, in my palette, I find myself reaching for less often than anticipated, and I will probably be replacing it with the Mount Amiata for my next refresh. The browns and oranges here are a mix of the Mayan yellow, which was super streaky. It's not something I would recommend. The quinacridone sienna, which also I found hard to work with, particularly here you can see the brush marks. It's also a little bit sticky. And the quinacridone deep gold, which on the other hand, I fell in love with and I have on my palette and I use all the time. But I do use these more later on in the sketchbook. And then the darkest darks here were the Enviro-friendly brown iron oxide and the Van Dyck brown. This page was a full page of French ultramarine. And let's talk about this because Daniel Smith proposes two ultramarines. One is labeled simply ultramarine blue. It is slightly cheaper. And then they have one labeled French ultramarine, which is slightly more expensive, and it is the same pigment. So in terms of the swatches, you can see here the ultramarine blue, the cheaper version, and the French ultramarine, the more expensive version. Same pigment, same light fastness, same qualities. Yet the French ultramarine truly is more intense, a little bit darker in its darkest values, and a little bit more vibrant. And this is more visible now over time. So these swatches were painted quite a while ago. They were painted over a year ago, about a year and a half ago. And the more time goes by, the more the difference between these two is pronounced. So it might be a question of light fastness. However, there should not be any reason for that because this book is closed all the time. So I don't really have particularly brilliant explanation for why, but the French ultramarine is aging better. Maybe because it's more concentrated, maybe there's less binder, I'm not sure, but with hindsight, I did purchase the cheaper ultramarine blue, and with hindsight, for my refresh, I will probably go with the French ultramarine just because it stays brighter for longer. For example, on this little fern sketch, I really like how even in the lightest concentrations, it has stayed very vibrant, and it's a lovely soft blue. I have nothing bad to say about it. And I rather wish I had picked this tube up instead of the cheaper version. Here I was trying to find any sketches to really use up a lot of the ultramarine and phthalo blue that I had. I really wasn't that crazy about the phthalo blue, so I just wanted something that fills a whole page so that I can really use it and get it out of the way. And I was trying to do bokeh effects on sea horizons. I'm not sure I would call it a success. It was an interesting experiment, and I don't think that doing this with blue is the best color because these blues are super staining, particularly the phthalo blues, and it is well nigh impossible to lift the blue once you have put it. So here I had the worst idea. I tried to put the blue down and then I tried to lift it while it was wet. That is not going to work. Here I had also tried to lift, but here I was using the turquoise, which for some reason was slightly easier to lift. But with the phthalo blue red shade, this was a nightmare. And then the darker regions are the Prussian blue. So here I was really learning that staining colors are not the best. I did like some of the effects of the mixing of the blues when the water kept going in. But it was really finicky, and also I was not in love with the phthalo blue. It's not a shade that I was particularly in love with. And the same for this turquoise, which I was using here, which was a mix of the phthalo blue green shade and also the phthalo turquoise. None of these I ended up taking for my palette. I wasn't that thrilled with them. And then it was jellyfish season. And here I was testing some fun colors. These were the manganese blue hue and the cobalt blue teal. Now, both of these were colors I thought I would have no use for, yet I ended up really enjoying them. Especially the manganese blue was a very bright blue. So the swatches alone are over here. And the cobalt teal blue is more on the turquoise side for me. It's already got a green hint. And then underneath it is a color called Fuchsite Genuine, which is also a Primatech color, but it has the particularity of having light reflective particles in it. So it's a shimmering paint. It has faded over time, so both in the sketch and on the swatch. Surprisingly, a year later already, the paint is no longer as sparkly, whereas initially when I had laid the paint down, it was super sparkly. And now on the tentacles of the jellyfish, where you can see the Fuchsite Genuine, there's barely any sparkle. It's very subtle. So this, if you're looking for a very subtle alternative to metallic paint, is a good option. But it does fade, so in a year's time, do not expect it to be as sparkly as the first day. And for the darkest tones, I was using some Prussian blue. So the jellyfish were a fun experiment. I really liked how light both the cobalt teal blue and manganese blue can go. So they're very nice for working in delicate layers, and because they are quite staining, also they're very good for glazing. And here we were getting into the deeper turquoises. So let me show you the swatch. This was already the phthalo turquoise, which is a very intense turquoise color. And I do have this on my palette, but I very rarely reach for it because it is so intense and overpowering. It can be extremely pigmented. A little goes a very long way. And here I was doing a tutorial on waves, also from a YouTube video by Niani, if I remember right. I will link her in my description box because I found her to be extremely helpful when I was looking for short tutorials with specific subjects to paint. So here I was just working with the phthalo turquoise as well as yellow ochre. I think this is a mixture of yellow ochre and Mars yellow. And still in the blues, this was my comfort zone. So I truly love the moody, inky blues. Here I was testing the indigo, and I already had this on my palette. I was already in love with it. There were no new discoveries here, apart from the fact that I truly enjoy working with it. And I had made a first little mushroom scene, which I thought looked quite nice. And then, as usual, I went and fidgeted with it, and it did not improve the state of things. So I was testing the Zoisite Genuine, and I had not used this particular green before. It is one of the Primatech colors, and I thought it might work as a background. Well, it granulates a lot. It's quite a weak color when used as a wash, and it did not work at all as a background. So that was really not a right choice as a background for a dark subject. So I went and redid them without. a background, which I preferred. And we have by now transitioned fully into the greens. So on this page, I was testing the Zoisite Genuine in a more concentrated form, and this does actually work well. It is a nice granulating green that separates into pigments that look almost brown and black. So they're quite warm, dark brown pigments on the green base, which is an interesting effect. For these pairs, I've gone with Undersea Green on the left, Hooker's Green, particularly for this one on the right. You can really see a lot of Hooker's Green here. The yellow highlights are Nickel Azo Yellow, which is a yellow I really enjoyed as well. It is a bit of a dirtier, more muted yellow, but it is transparent and very nice to work with. The red touches are some roasted French ochre. And then for the stems, I've gone with the enviro-friendly yellow iron oxide and the transparent brown oxide. The shadows were indigo, and here at the bottom pairs we have some Cascade Green for the 6 on the left and Jadeite Genuine for the 2 on the right. So the Undersea Green is this nice, deep, almost olive green, and it is a green that I've fallen in love with. I have on my palette, I reach for all the time. The Deep Sap Green is also one I have on that palette because it can become really concentrated and dark, and it's a very nice color for deepening your greens. The Hooker's Green is something I've never added into my palette because it's very vibrant. It's got that shiny green apple nature to it, and it's a little bit too intense. To see the swatches on their own, to give you an idea, the Hooker's Green is over here. And underneath it, we have the Deep Sap Green and the Undersea Green. So this one I find is a lovely sort of khaki green, and the Deep Sap Green also is a nice muted deep green, which I found very easy to work with. The surprise was the Cascade Green, which is a nice sweet spot between blue and green. It's quite a granulating color, and it does have quite a bit of variation, and it's also quite a light color. It won't go very dark, but it is a very nice, interesting color to work with. It's quite unusual, and it is something that I have in a tube that I sometimes reach for. It's not on my permanent palette, but it is a nice one to reach for. While I was working with the browns, I already discovered that the transparent brown oxide that I was using here is diffusing beautifully and is a lovely warm brown. So the transparent oxide range, be it the yellow, brown or red oxide, is a lovely, lovely range. And on the contrary, I found that the whole enviro-friendly iron oxide range, be it the yellow, brown or red, were not my jam. So they were very hard to work with. They granulate strongly, and also I did not find them easy to spread. So already here, even though I'm on the greens, I already started to develop a very strong preference for the transparent oxides versus the enviro-friendly, which I found quite messy, quite clumpy, and they were not my favorite. The Jadeite Genuine was a green that was really interesting. It's a dark, intense green that also granulates with pigments that separate into a purplish, blackish color. So there's also a very interesting effect, and it does have quite strong granulation. Here we are still on some Nickel Azo Yellow and Jadeite Genuine, and at the bottom we have some Viridian for these guys. The Jadeite Genuine was actually very versatile, so it's on its own here, and here I'm mixing it with some Garnet Genuine for the red highlights. And I did find it quite dark though. It's a very moody dark green with a bit of blue undertones, and the fact that these pigments granulate into a dark, almost blackish granulation on it made it into something that I didn't really see what I would use it for. It is interesting, it's fun to work with, but I didn't really see which subjects I would be using it for. The Nickel Azo Yellow I had actually really enjoyed, and this is something I would happily add in the future. And the Viridian, let's talk about this for a second. It seems to be a staple on many people's palettes. I know people use it as a mixing base, apparently. I absolutely did not like this. I found it very weak. The intensity of the pigment was very weak. I was expecting, because Viridian usually would mean an emerald green, This to me reads as blue. It doesn't read as green. Now this might just be linked to my eyes, because that's a very individual thing as to how where people differentiate blue from green in their vision. But to me this reads as blue. It wasn't intense. It granulated a little bit too strongly for my taste. I didn't find it great as a mixing color with other colors. It's not something I would have reached for. This was overall a disappointment. I've seen so many people using it, and when I had it in my hands, I just did not have fun with it. But I definitely did enjoy the Cascade green and the Undersea green. Those were two keepers. The Garnet Genuine I had very little of, and I actually finished it here on this page. But this is a Primatech color, and it is a lovely warm red. This is something I would love to pick up, but it was a little bit pricier because it was a Primatech color, and I could only pick up so many of them before the budget ran out. Always problems of being limited by the budget. Here I was testing more sparkly colors, so I had laid down a very dark base for this guy with some Prussian blue and indigo, and I really wanted to test the Duochromes. So I've got the Duochrome Emerald for him, as well as the Amethyst Genuine, which is a very sparkly purple color. And I will try and maneuver him in the light to try and demonstrate some of the sparkles. They're quite hard to see always on camera when the page is immobile. But these turned out really well, particularly the Amethyst Genuine is really a lovely smoky quartz purple, and in the eyes as well, you can see that that one turned out really intense. And the Duochrome Emerald was also quite intense compared to the other Duochromes. As for the other colors, so the Phthalo Green is this very bright green. It is something that looks very artificial and acidic, but that I actually enjoy. I really enjoy this for underwater scenes, for example, mixed in with other colors. It's very juicy. So funnily enough, I did enjoy this one. And here I was just layering some greens as well. So the Hooker's Green and the Phthalo Green Yellow shade. Definitely prefer the Phthalo Green Blue shade, which is cooler, the yellow shade, which I did not find as intense or vibrant. Of course, it's warmer, but also I found that it lacked a bit of intensity and vibrancy. And the Hooker's Green, which I had already tried and did not find much practical use for in my style of painting. If I was painting jungles and rainforests, this would definitely be a staple, but I don't. And then the Deep Sap Green on the legs in particular, which is a lovely muted deep green. Here I was having an experiment. So I had been to Greece a few months earlier, and I took a lovely photo of some leaves against a wall outside, and they had the most beautiful shadows. And I thought this would make a lovely composition. I came home, I experimented with this, and this is where you live and learn, because my composition skills were not what I'd imagined. The whole thing didn't turn out well, and I do understand that there's a problem between the amount of contrast here. And when I squint, basically the leaves and the background are the same value, and that means that everything just flows into one. And also this color here, the neutral tint for the shadows, is just not working. It's way too desaturated and cold. So you live and learn, but this was the permanent green. And once again, if I was painting tropical scenes like this more often, if I was painting banana leaves and palm trees and jungles and bamboo forests, this is something I would have. Same as the Hooker's Green, it would be very useful, but I don't really paint tropical vegetation, except when I was testing this. So it's not something I picked up, but it's very easy to work with paint. You have the swatch right here. It's a lovely medium green, very juicy as well. And if I painted subjects of that color, then I would definitely have it as a convenience mixture. The other greens I looked at here, we've got the Deep Sap Green, which I've already spoken about several times. It's a lovely, intense, muted green. The Prussian Green, which is, again, a color that can go very dark, as well as very light. It's quite vibrant, very easy to work with. And up here we have the chromium green oxide, which was actually a funny one. I did not see myself enjoying this. I thought it would be a very weird color. I didn't really see what people would use it for. But now I'm doing some urban work from time to time and different scenes where I would actually want a light, almost milky green. So this is a very interesting color, and especially when it's very diluted, I found that it could make very, very pretty effects. It has sort of a milky quality to it, which is very interesting. And down here, I was using a mixture of cobalt green and cobalt green pale. So the cobalt green pale is truly pale. It's not a joke. So that was quite hard actually to even form an opinion on. It was quite hard to get a layer of it down. It granulated quite strongly. It wasn't smooth. It wasn't easy to work with. And I struggled to actually make it concentrated enough to actually see the color. And it's not something I actually found a particular purpose for. The cobalt green, however, is interesting if you're looking for a green in these tones. And what I did find interesting is that here as well, I layered the fuchsite over it. So this is a fuchsite genuine, and it is another one of the sparkly colors. So some of these leaves have a bit of sparkle, as well as some of these grapes. And once again, they're very hard to see on the camera. The comment I would make about these is that they are very, very subtle. So if you like the color, choose it for the color, don't choose it for the sparkle, because if you want a metallic sparkly one, then go for a real metallic, maybe even from a different brand, but the fuchsite genuines will not live up to your expectations if you're looking for true sparkle. This is another example. So I had made a base with Hansa Yellow Medium and Phthalo Turquoise to get a green, and I really wanted a green that would be quite close to the fuchsite genuine, so that I could then layer over the fuchsite genuine for the sparkles. And the sparkles are barely visible, and this has become more and more pronounced over time. So now that time has gone by since I painted this, I'm trying to incline this at quite a radical angle to try and demonstrate the sparkles. You can make them out around the base of the jellyfish, but it is very difficult to make out. So interesting color, but I would advise you to take it for the color and not for the sparkles. And here I was testing some of the bright greens, so the permanent green light. And I was mixing it with the quinacridone gold and a bit of phthalo turquoise to see how I could modulate it and make more muted, natural looking greens, and also with the Aussie red gold to try and make dirtier greens. And this was fun. I do like this for a mix. The permanent green light is not one I ended up picking up for everyday use, but it is a very nice, bright spring green color. And once again, if you're painting things like fresh young vegetation, it would probably have a lot of use. But the quinacridone gold and Aussie red gold I already loved, and I loved the way they mute the greens and blues. And staying with these golds, I was moving into the browns. This is a piece that is inspired from Inga Buividavice's book. I actually also reviewed the book in a previous video where I was talking about the watercolor books that I learned watercolor painting from, and I will link the video up here. But here I was using Aussie red gold and quinacridone gold for these warm gold tones, and indigo. So I was just mixing the greens with the indigo and the quinacridone gold. And I truly love that combination. This is something I reach for all the time, especially now in autumn. The last few weeks I have found myself really reaching for these combinations to create these autumn tones. In the browns, so here we were going deep into brown territory, and it was autumn. Actually, it was already winter by now. This was in November, and I would go out for walks and pick up bunches of chestnuts and dry leaves from the ground, and these would be sitting on my desk for days, and it was quite intense. I had quite a collection going on my desk. But in terms of the browns, here I'm using a hematite burnt scarlet for the very dark parts, as well as the enviro-friendly yellow iron oxide. And this is just my personal opinion, but I hated it. I found the whole enviro-friendly iron oxide range very difficult to work with, they don't spread as smoothly as I would like them to. They are hard to, they granulate a little bit too much, or not in the way that I find pleasing personally. So for me, the whole enviro-friendly iron oxide range was very difficult to work with. I did not enjoy it. The hematite burnt scarlet is also a Primatec color, on the other hand, and it is also granulating, yet I found it a lot easier to work with. So for example, this chestnut here is purely the hematite burnt scarlet, and I find that it has like a richer intensity, and the actual texture on the paint is a little bit more, I almost want to say velvety, compared to the enviro-friendlies, which were not. I actually cannot find right now off the top of my head the word that would describe them best to me, but I just did not enjoy working with them. And then also some Aussie red gold to add some orange tones. And all of these muted greens were just mixed with the different blues, so indigo, blue apatite, genuine lunar blue, and mixing those with some Aussie red gold. So this was just the brown mixes here, and these are really good mixes. I mean, the Aussie red gold with any of the blues will make really lovely muted greens. And still inspired by Inga Buividavice's book, I was also working in the muted greens. So this is still some Aussie red gold, quinacridone gold, and then a mix of the different blues. And I just carried on with the same colors. I was staying in this brown theme with mixed browns. And here I was doing some oak leaves. And funnily enough, I ended up really preferring the naked oak leaves, the ones which I actually hadn't filled in, where I only had some hints of shape and shadow. And for some reason I found these very whimsical. Whereas the ones with the splatters, here I found them still nice. I did end up overworking them on the next page. And I'm using Moon Glow for the shadows. And on this day I had them laid out on the desk in front of me, and there was a particularly strong ray of sunlight coming through. And there was such a stark contrast between these sharp shadows and the leaves. So I had a lot of fun that day just sketching the shadows. And the Moon Glow was already one that I wanted on my palette, but I just really fell in love with how versatile and transparent this color can be, and just how much it varies or changes. So it really goes from the blue to purple to gray tones. And here I was still playing with these shadows, and this is a tendency I have. The sketchbook really taught me so much, not just about each pigment, but forcing me to move through different choices of subjects and maybe different styles as I went along. Really taught me my weaknesses as well. And really I have a tendency to overwork. So here, on the contrary, I find the leaves already overworked and over intense. Too many layers of paint, too much pigment, and this I'm extremely guilty of, is that I will put too much pigment on the paper right away instead of building up my layers much more gradually with much less pigment. And I tend to be impatient. That really is my weakness. And so I try to be more restrained. I spent many hours trying to make a little composition here. And now in hindsight, when I go back, I find that I could have pushed further. I could have added a little bit more texture or detail to the leaves, or maybe some splatters, or maybe some effects in the background. So there is a happy medium to find, which I'm still struggling to find, but it is a journey. And now into the warmer, redder browns. So some of these were a lot of fun. The Garnet Genuine, which I spoke about earlier with the pears, is a Primatec color, and it is beautiful. This is something I would like to pick up. And I was using it on these mushrooms, and then the dark areas are the Burgundy Red Ochre. Burgundy Red Ochre, which is also a very nice granulating red-brown. And then the Tiger's Eye Genuine for the little leaves, which was quite a nice pale yellowish brown. I did find it a little bit too pale and too slick for my purposes. It does also have that slick quality where brush marks are very visible, and it doesn't necessarily spread very well over a wet surface. The Garnet Genuine, though, I did love. It's a very soft color that almost melts into the paper. It doesn't get very dark, but it is very vibrant and beautiful. And more than vibrant, I would say it's very light. Here I was using some of the burnt yellow ochre, which I did not find particularly exciting. It granulated well, it spread well, but the color was, I would say, less impressive than some of the other colors in the range. And here we have the enviro-friendly iron oxide, and this is where I want to complain, because the way it granulates is probably good for someone who has more experience, and this is probably just my own inexperience talking, but I really didn't enjoy it. I found it very rough in a way that it would create jagged patterns and clump, and it was very difficult to gradiate it. If I wanted to do a graduated wash, that was really difficult. It was just very difficult to work with as a beginner, and I wanted to complain about that for a moment. Whereas by contrast, the transparent oxide family, here I'm using the transparent brown oxide, were beautifully transparent and much smoother, but also much easier to work with. And the English red ochre, which was also a lovely earth tone, and this is a transparent red oxide for these ones, and then this is a mix of English red ochre and transparent brown oxide. But the transparent red oxide as well, I absolutely loved. I found it rich, intense, vibrant, whereas the eco-friendly red oxide, in comparison, looks a little bit like dead meat to me. I wasn't crazy about it. So I definitely prefer the transparent oxide range. And I will probably in the future be swapping out my burnt umber for the transparent brown oxide and my burnt sienna for the transparent red oxide, because I actually really enjoy these so much. Here I was working with the Indian red, and this is an opaque color. It's a funny fish. I don't know what to make of it because I didn't really see a purpose for this immediately. It doesn't feel fully like a watercolor because it's so opaque. It's quite thick. It does spread well. It is quite easy to work with, but it is a bit of a dull, dark red, and I didn't find it particularly beautiful in terms of hue, nor did I find it particularly useful just simply due to the fact that it was so opaque. So I don't really understand the purpose of this one. By now I was testing the different earth tones, and to add interest, actually how far are we? So here we were looking at the earth tones, and a lot of them are the ones from this page. And I was mixing them with the sparkling colors. So for the first branch on the left, I'm using the Italian burnt sienna and the fired gold ochre for the flowers, and then the iridescent bronze in touches. And here I really need to incline the page for the iridescent colors to show up. So the leaves are Italian burnt sienna, which is a lovely light brown to work with. This is something that I would want to paint things like terracotta pots with. I really enjoyed this one. The fired gold ochre on the flowers was also very easy and nice to work with, quite a reddish brown. And the iridescent bronze was also very shiny. So the iridescent range kept their sparkle a lot better than the Primatech range. Like the Fuchsite Genuine, for example, did not keep its sparkle even half as well as these. For the second branches, I've used some Lunar Earth and the Lunar Red Rock, which is this very opaque red again. And I have trouble understanding these very opaque colors. They're intense, they're interesting, but I really have trouble understanding them because it's not really what I would want to mix into a piece. And here for the sparkling touches, I've added some iridescent antique copper and iridescent antique bronze. So the copper is on the berries and the bronze is on the leaves. And these were nice, but it's just not necessarily the tones I would use. The Lunar Earth in particular, I found a little bit frustrating to work with because it would granulate in a very sharp way. So I'm trying to point out a particular leaf here where you can even see not just the paint strokes, but even sort of the bubbles where a little bit of air had gotten into the paintbrush. And I'm not sure where I would want to use that. When I'm trying to make a smooth blended piece, this I find a little bit frustrating, these kind of textures. It's not really the type of granulation I enjoy. I enjoy a more even and smooth granulation like I would see on the leaves on the first branch. Here I was using, for the third branch, I was using a roasted French ochre with a Venetian red for the flowers and then Aztec gold accents. The roasted French ochre is actually also a lovely milky pink earth tone. And these are actually the granulating effects that I enjoy. They're a little bit smoother, less harsh. There's none of that crackling and clumping. So I found this very pretty to work with. It is a little bit on the milky side, but it is actually a very nice earth tone. The Venetian red, also one of these funny colors because it's opaque. I don't really know what to make of it. And the Aztec gold, which is a very bright yellow gold. And for the last one, I was using burnt bronzite genuine and anti-copper for the accents. And the base was mummy bauxite. And this was also a strange one. And I'm saying strange because I don't really know the technical term, but the granulation on it, the color itself was lovely. It's a soft, warm, light brown. But the color on it, even though it was lovely, the granulation was not really my cup of tea. And here I was just trying all of these out on separate subjects. So the Venetian red, which was this funny color in that it's also very opaque, but it is actually a nice tone. So it's got a lovely rust brick red to it. And then I'm using Mayan yellow for the string, and the shadows are in hematite genuine. I used it because I had the swatch card. It's not one I would buy. And the enviro-friendly red iron oxide with the shadows in burnt umber. This one, every little sketch and doodle I did with enviro-friendly, I wanted to tear my hair out by the end. This was the wrong choice for a smooth terracotta pot. It was almost impossible getting a smooth finish with it, and it was a real test of my patience. Versus, for example, the transparent red oxide, where this was a quick 10-minute sketch, and this was a lot easier to get a smooth effect on. So definitely less of a headache, easier to work with, and not my cup of tea again. Here I'm using the Italian burnt sienna with the burnt umber for the shadows. And the Italian burnt sienna also is one of the lighter, softer earth tones that's very easy to work with, as well as the burnt sienna light. These were both very easy. And one that I also really enjoyed was the burgundy red ochre, which I've used on this little Moroccan clay horse. And that was a lovely color to work with. The burgundy ochres, the burgundy yellow ochre and the burgundy red ochre were both very nice. And I've actually picked up the burgundy ochre, which I can show you over here. So I've picked up the burgundy yellow ochre for my palette instead of the yellow ochre, which you see below it. I found it a little bit softer and more natural. And the red ochre as well was a real pleasure to work with. So if you're looking for a terracotta pot color, this would be a lovely contender, the burgundy red ochre, or the Italian burnt sienna, or the transparent red oxide if you're looking for something that granulates less and is even smoother. Still in the Venetian red, they gave me so much on their dot card. I was painting with this for days. And yes, it's easier to paint with, but it still feels a bit like a gouache to me on the final result. And here's the Indian red again. And once again, funny color. It's very opaque. It's got some granulation going on. I'm not sure what to make of it. I'm not sure where I would use this in a piece, especially next to or with other colors. And here I'm just using a hematite genuine, which actually is a nice color if you want to add a bit of gray granulating mix. And here I came onto some interesting colors that I didn't see myself enjoying. But there was a good surprise. So on this Nautilus, the reds are a mix of Indian red on the lighter ones and lunar red rock on the darker ones. So the Indian red we've spoken about, it becomes very opaque, and I don't really see it playing well with other colors. The lunar red rock also was a bit of a funny bird. in that it was very intensely granulating, and the red itself was also very pronounced, earth red. Not something that I would reach for in my palette, but the Bloodstone Genuine that I started using as the shadows here had a very interesting granulating effect, and the color was a very nice variation between the grays, browns and reds. So I ended up doing a whole little piece with it, which I will hold up a little bit closer to the camera. And it was perfect for this kind of effect. So if you're looking for something to do rocks, fossils, riverbeds in, this is really nice. It's a very nice alternative to plain black. It's got very nice little reddish pigments in it, and it granulates beautifully. It really almost has a fossil or rock effect already. In the darker browns, I was looking at the Van Dyke brown, the Cyclorite Genuine, which is over here, and the Sepia, some more enviro-friendly brown oxides. So they had given me a huge blob of this enviro-friendly iron oxide stuff, and I was getting so tired of it by the end. I found it very difficult to paint with. What I did find very pleasing was the Van Dyke brown. So this as well, for a burnt umber, if you're looking for something non-granulating, it's a good alternative. It does go extremely dark. Once again, a little goes a very long way, and you can get lovely smooth effects with it if you are patient, which is always a challenge for me. But I found the Van Dyke brown to be very good, especially for things like botanical subjects or nature, little natural subjects. I thought this was lovely. The Cyclorite Genuine, which is this yellowish brown here, was a hard one. It's another Primatec color. It granulates into sharp little clumps. It's very difficult to get any highlights or contrast with. It doesn't go very dark. It forms a very thick residue on the paper when you start laying it darker. Not an easy color to work with. Once again, this, unless you... Actually, I'm not even going to extrapolate. I don't know who uses this, and I don't know how. There are surely better ways of doing it, but this is how I tried it, and I was not in love with it. And then the head of this little horseshoe crab is with Sepia, and this is a very simple neutral color. I have this on my palette. I use it actually a lot for things like the urban scenes I do, or statues or sculptures. And it's quite good for those graphic elements. However, I will not be renewing it, and I will probably be opting out and going with the Van Dyke brown instead in the future, because I just find this one actually easier to work with. So the enviro-friendly brown iron oxide, maybe I should stop complaining, so I will just not comment on this because it was very difficult to work with. I was ready to throw my sketchbook out the window by now. And especially since by now we were in December, I had been working in the sketchbook for 7 months. And here I was finishing up with the Van Dyke brown. I was very happy to finish with the Van Dyke brown. It was a lot easier to work with. I like the fact that it's quite a cool, neutral, grayish brown. And the raw umber, which was surprisingly a pleasant color and also easy to work with, but that was not intense enough for me to justify adding it to my palette. And getting onto the final pages, this is where I was testing some more of the duochrome colors, and I really ended up enjoying these. I am usually not a big fan of sparkly or metallic colors, but the duochromes really seduced me. They've got a lovely shimmer, and what I will show you in the light, you can really see that they've got different reflections. And so the ones I really enjoyed were the blues and greens. So the duochrome blue pearl is this blue and silver, which is lovely. And the duochrome turquoise, I actually ended up picking up both of these because I couldn't choose. And I find them gorgeous, especially for subjects like this, like marine subjects. It works really well. The emerald is also a very intense green. And then there's this interesting oceanic, which has reflections of blue, gold, and green in it. The duochrome, so here we have the violet pearl and the hibiscus, which is a bright pink and a bright purple. Lovely bright colors, but not ones that I could see myself using. And the other one, which I'll make a special mention for, is the autumn mystery, which is very intense and also I found quite versatile. And at the end of the sketchbook, I was following a course again on Skillshare this time from Victoria Calderon, who I had already followed one of her courses on Domestica in my previous sketchbook. And this course was about painting your personal talisman. So it was 4 weeks, and each week we had a 2-hour class. And we would first have preparatory exercises for the first 3 weeks. And then in the last week, we painted our personal talisman with elements that represented us. And being as indecisive as I am, I had to go through several versions. So my first version of my personal talisman was actually this one over here. And I had chosen the moon, which was a waxing crescent, because I was at the start of some projects that I had started in my personal and professional life. So it was representing the phase of life I'm in. The garnet, because it's my birthstone. The snake, because of my profession. I'm a medical professional. And the black leopard, which is my spirit animal. And the protea, because it's the national flower of South Africa, and I'm originally South African, and chestnut flowers. And then I also went with the day and night dichotomy, and then the water, because firstly I'm Aquarius, and secondly I absolutely love water. It really is my element. And I ended up hating what I'd done with it. I thought that the rays of sunshine here were too much. They were quite jarring compared to the style of the rest of the painting. So I decided to have a second shot at it. And I had been experimenting with ways to transition the sky into the sea. So I tried to make a wave transitioning to a cloud. I was a little bit happier with it, but there was a but. I wasn't 100% happy. I still felt like it wasn't really, it felt a bit messy. I didn't really like it. It didn't really feel like a talisman. So I came back for the third attempt over here. And three's a charm. I was a lot happier with this one. It was simpler. I found that it sort of told the story better. It was more compact. I had to leave out the garnet. I didn't have a place to put it. I did put the little starfish in to represent the sea and the ocean, but I really enjoyed actually having a more compact single item as the composition. And then in all of them, I've used some acrylic gold paint, which was a lot of fun. This was also one of the exercises from the same course with Victoria Calderon. It was one of our warm-ups in the first 3 weeks. We were doing moon phases. So I was just experimenting different ways of representing the different phases of the moon. So using things like masking fluid and Posca pen and watercolor. And these were some of my early attempts at lettering. I absolutely love lettering when other people do it. And it is something I want to learn, so that is on my wish to learn list. And then I finally closed the sketchbook at the beginning of January 2024. I got onto my last and final spread, and this was very strongly inspired by Victoria Calderon's style, because I had spent the last 4 weeks in weekly classes with her online. And so I had the moon where I'm using the iridescent silver from Daniel Smith, which worked beautifully for this. Very happy with this. And I was using some more of the duochromes. The peonies actually have the duochrome mauve, which I was very happy with. And there's also the duochrome pink and mauve on the lupin flowers. And then I've outlined everything in some acrylic gold paint. And the background is a very deep indanthrone blue. And I'm trying to rotate this again quite crazily against the light to show you that there's a little bit of sheen to the indanthrone blue. It really is it almost feels watertight. You know, it's got that little bit of a sheen to it, and it's a very, very intense blue. And unlike the indigo, it doesn't granulate. So if you're looking for a very thick, very smooth, very dark blue, indanthrone blue, definitely the way to go. Lovely warm color. And for the white parts, I just used masking fluid before painting, which was a mitigated success. But there we have it, end of the sketchbook. And you may have noticed, if you're a good observer, that there is something missing. We have gone through all of the colors up to the browns, but we are missing the grays and blacks. And that actually is something that I finished in my next sketchbook, in the fourth one. So I'll be sharing that shortly. and you will see the last trials with the browns and the blacks in the next sketchbook. I hope that you have enjoyed the sketchbook tour and that it has maybe been helpful to you in choosing some of your next colors to try or to add to your palette. And if you have made it to the end, let me know by leaving a comment below. Today's comment is jellyfish, because I really like these guys. And thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day and take care. Bye. As an afterthought, I've just realized that it might be helpful if I include just images of the swatches on their own that I had done for each 238 colors. So I'm just showing you the pages of my swatches that you can screenshot if you want to for your own reference. Here we have the yellows and oranges. And the reds and pinks, as well as the violets and some of the purples. And the rest of the purples and the blues. The greens and turquoises. Moving into the earth tones and ochres. And the orange and brown earth tones. And this is what was missing from this sketchbook, was the grays and blacks, which I finished in the 4th sketchbook, as well as the iridescent colors, the duochromes and the metallics. So I hope those are useful to you if you want to screenshot them as references when making your own choices. Thank you again for watching. Bye.